welcome. Hi, Kathy. Hello, JP, Rachel, Allison, Renee. Glad that you're here. Hey, Jen. Hi, Allison. Well, welcome, folks. Glad to be able to be in this space together tonight, and glad to get to be here with Rose, one of my favorite people to talk about astrology with.
Hello, it's really nice to be here with Renee. The feeling is very mutual. I think a lot of times when I feel like I'm really spinning out, I just send Renee wild voice memos, and that's been going on with us for the past couple weeks. So we thought maybe other folks might like to spin out together, spin in, maybe.
Hi, Sherry. So before we start tonight, we thought that we would just take some time to set some intentions, ask for some communal care inside of our group, and then also to offer dedication and give a little bit of a sense of time and how we're going to be with time tonight. Rose took notes of our intentions, but you want to start?
Sure. I think first and foremost, I don't want to fully speak from Renee, but I know that we do share some ideas and ideals. We are both pro-human, pretty anti-government. We tend to fall very left. I think we would both like to see a world with much less suffering and understand that there's a lot of work required to do that. My hope is to bring compassion and understanding and to really kind of feel into astrology as a tool of understanding and kind of broadening context and perspective, while also recognizing that there is a huge amount of grief and pain and suffering kind of circling in the collective. And I in no way want to minimize that. And I do not want to dehumanize anyone or their experience in this conversation. So that's the intention that I'm bringing. And the folks who I've been looking to for guidance have been Indigenous thinkers and activists, Black thinkers and activists, anybody, Palestinian voices, anti-Zionist Jewish voices, folks who understand that the people who have the boots on our necks have them on all of our necks, and that if we're going to find any liberation anywhere, it's got to be through bridge building and connection and collective striving towards that. So that is what I'm bringing into this conversation and what I strive to bring to my work and kind of the political lens that I'm working from.
Yeah, I agree with that. Concur. Someone sent me a message and said my volume was hard to hear. Can you hear me better now? Tried to switch it. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Yeah, so I really resonate with what Rose shared and want to echo that as an astrologer and as a body worker, I really can't help but hold a perspective that is cyclical and both historic and futuristic, and really mycelial in the sense that I don't feel that any connections in terms of experiences that we're having are linear. And so activation of a huge amount of collective trauma and collective attention, as we've been experiencing in the last couple of weeks, could only happen on this level if we were really working with incredibly charged material. And every person on this call, without a doubt, and every person alive right now, without a doubt, and every person alive for a long time, without a doubt, is living in a body in a place that has been profoundly affected by war. And we all respond to war. It's very deep inside of our cellular memory and cellular tissue. And I am really feeling in a lot of ways the trance of war and what happens in terms of the collective psyche and the collective body. And so it's my intention tonight to actually not focus too acutely or specifically on only current events, but really try and hold a broad perspective and an archetypal and symbolic perspective and a spiritual perspective. And inside of that perspective, echoing what Rose said, I identify as somebody who really doesn't resonate with governmental structure for the most part. The way that governance has been institutionalized, formalized, braided together with capitalism or profit. I don't even want to say it's just capitalism because it's many systems and systems of supremacy and profit and militarization, I think are the deep undercurrents of what's happening now. And so I want to hold space tonight that allows for critique of governments and also holds a huge amount of compassion for people, and really kind of strives to hold all of us in our humanity and in our feelings and in the internalization of oppression that we're all working with, and also with the transformation and the healing that we're all working with. And so I would ask also that folks who are here with us really hold an intention of compassion for everybody in this group. And for the first part of our time together, we've actually closed the chat and haven't made it available to people to unmute. We will be opening up a conversation space after we talk for a while. And I think now that this intention has been set, I do want to open the chat. So if folks have questions while we're talking, or if you don't understand something that we say about astrology, you can write in and people can see each other's questions. So I'm gonna open up the chat space. And again, I really, the request for being in the space tonight is that there's compassion and consideration of everybody in this space. If you feel really strongly identified with one group of people or one particular stance, we ask that you just hold spaciousness to consider other perspectives if they happen to come up. And as somatic practitioner myself, and I think a lot of people here, I really want to encourage all of us to work with our own activation if it's present. And you can do that by breathing, by rocking in your chair, by stretching your face and your body and making sounds. And of course, you can get up and leave. You don't have to stay. Yeah, that's what I'm going to say. Yeah. So I guess the last thing I'll say is that both Rose and I are calling in from stolen land here in the United States of America, so-called, on Turtle Island. I'm in the Pacific Northwest, on the stolen lands of the Chinook, the Multnomah, the Kalapuya, multiple tribes and bands. Because pre-colonial governance, there weren't the same kinds of borders as there are now, and such delineated territories. And I'm also calling in from a place that is incredibly lush, that has a lot of rivers and trees and forests and wildlife, a place where food has been historically abundant. And before there were fences and streets and a lot of private property in the place that I am, the way that land was tended here was for abundance for everyone. So food was grown in spaces where people could partake of food, and water was cared for in ways that people and animals, living beings, could partake of water. Yeah, so that's where I'm coming from tonight.
And I'm coming from land that was traditionally Tiwa land, but also I technically still live on the land of the Picaris Pueblo, and that's in northern New Mexico, which has been highly contested, has a very violent, contentious history that is unique and also echoes and reverberates out across current events, right? Multiple groups of people vying for resources that at one time were freely given, vying for a place, calling it home that has not always been their home, and also displacing and dispossessing folks who have long-standing relationship and lineage here. And I think that it's really useful for all of us to reflect the ways that we are implicated, complicit, or not, the ways that we have been displaced and dispossessed, the ways that we've been colonized, the ways that we have benefited from this violence, because there is a need to ground down into the reality of these moments if we are going to move anywhere from them, right? If we're existing in a kind of state of disassociation or non-presence, we can't actually actively participate in what's around us and what's happening.
Yeah. Where should we start? Do you want to start with the chart of Biden's address or with the US Sibly chart?
I think we should start with Biden's address, and I think that because I think it locates us in the present moment and then allows us to spiral forward and backward the way that we both know reality and experience to do, right? If we're talking about non-linearity, let's start where we are and then go from there.
Okay. Which reminds me of one of our other intentions. Maybe we'll remember all of our intentions by the time we end, but another intention we had was just non-completion. So we're going to be presenting charts and we're going to be talking about them in the way that we do, which is tangential. And Rose and I are young, we're not that old. We haven't been around that long and we're humans. So, we're biased and imperfect and uneducated about a lot of things. And we're also both scholars and learning and seeking to educate ourselves. So we're not here to make any definitive arguments tonight. We're just here to talk about charts and to think into the symbolism of astrology. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. You guys can see this okay? So this is the Placidus chart for Biden's State of the Union address on Thursday evening, this past Thursday. And for folks who are newer to astrology, we're going to talk about astrology. So if you're newer to astrology and the lingo isn't like totally familiar to you, you're welcome to ask in the chat if you have a question, and we can answer if we see it, and also people can answer for each other. But we're definitely going to be using technical astro language. And one thing about an election chart, which is what this isn't a natal chart. This is a chart of the moment of an event beginning. Is that we're looking at like mundane astrology, what's happening in the world. But this is also from the perspective of Biden's speech in Washington, D.C. It started at 8 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday. And Gemini is on the ascendant. Gemini is associated with speeches and with speech as a function. Gemini is ruled by Mercury, and Thursday was the Mercury Cazimi. That's the superior conjunction of Mercury to the Sun. And this is a pretty important point in the Mercury retrograde cycles. And at the superior conjunction, there's a symbol of a kind of long-term plan being focused upon and seated within consciousness. This is also a period of time in which the thought process is looking long term, but it also isn't particularly reflective or retrospective yet. And there's a kind of impulsiveness and hastiness in this moment of the superior conjunction. And there's kind of the idea of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. And so there's this inception of an idea of human capacity that's often also rooted in, I'm going to say, desire, and the correlation between desire and the feeling of knowing something or having an answer is something that I want to presence right now, that particularly when there's a position of power like the United States has, or like Biden has as the president of the United States, you know, people in positions of power have the authority to say things and say them, declare them as truth, like declare them as like this is the way that something is, or to declare knowing. And what we know and what we want are not easy to separate. And so the Sun and Mercury conjunct at 26 degrees of Libra in the sixth house, which is a house of military, in a sign that is very much linked to notions of justice. But at the 26th degree, there's a kind of yin yang symbolism and a mirror imploding in upon itself. I mean, it's kind of like the two sides are spiraling. So this is a place where like non-dualism and dualism really get existentially interesting at 26 degrees of Libra. Like, what is justice, you know? How do we see ourselves and one another, I think is important for that degree. So the chart ruler is in a moment of a pretty big declaration of justice. That could be one word to be used, but also squaring Pluto in the ninth house in Capricorn. And so there's definitely the influence here of superiority and knowing, kind of the big daddy US, I know what to do vibe. And Pluto's at 27 degrees of Capricorn, which is the birth degree of the United States Pluto. So the US is in its Pluto return. This is the first time that's happened since 1776, and the Declaration of Independence was signed. And I'll say one last thing and then turn it over to Rose, but cycles of Pluto and Capricorn historically correspond with kind of acceleration of industries of death and the formalization, concretization of powerful forces who use death to become more powerful. And so Pluto was in Capricorn when the US was incorporated on stolen land. Pluto was in Capricorn when the transatlantic slave trade began. Pluto was in Capricorn in a time in European history in terms of like the colonial projects of religious supremacy, when indigenous, pagan, kind of smaller tribal peoples in the European continent were losing their land and being homogenized by the church under the entrapment movement. And so Pluto in Capricorn has a resonance with periods of time in which dominant forces and dominant power become more formalized through weaponry, coercion, and a kind of implementation of the state. Take it, Rose.
Well, I'd like to just build a little bit more on these couple of placements. There's a lot to dig into with this chart, but you know, this Kazemi moment, a Sun-Mercury conjunction, implies an over-identification with your ideas and with your thoughts, that what I think, therefore I am, what I say is who I am. And you know, in the sign of Libra, there can be this feeling that my thoughts are just, what I'm doing is just, I am fair and impartial, which we already know is a lie, right? There's actually no such thing as being impartial. We all have our own biases that we bring to things, and particularly nations do. And so what's interesting to me with that Pluto square is that there is an immediate contradiction between this self-concept of being the arbiter of justice and the fact that we actually are built upon these exploitive, extractive, violent power structures. right? And so this idea of I'm giving this speech as the leader of the free world, whatever that means, we know that the actual ideology, the ninth house's ideology, meaning making, what we kind of gather around, the ideas that we worship or that we build our civilizations upon, are extraction, exploitation, violence. So there is already this confrontation with what we say versus what we do or what we really believe or worship, which is war. And then we have this cementing, which is happening from, there is a trine here from the Sun Mercury conjunction to Saturn and Pisces up in the 10th house. The 10th house is what we project out into the world, right? And so, and Saturn tends to constrict, it hardens, it makes permanent. In the sign of Pisces, it makes it very easy to rationalize, to feel pretty confident that we're doing something for the right reason and that everyone can kind of rally around this idea. And so there is this hope or aspiration that this speech is going to rally people around this idea and can hopefully kind of gloss over the glaring contradictions in the way that we particularly treat those we count as foreign as well, because the ninth is distant, unfamiliar places. And if Pluto is falling there, there is this idea that there's a justification to extract from or dominate those we consider other. And yet we're meant to somehow reach out across differences to band together behind this idea. That's what I see as the kind of contradiction between these. And one other point I want to bring into this before I hand it back to Renee is that the moon, which is often regarded as the people, in the US Sibly chart is at 28 degrees of Aquarius, which is very close to where Saturn is stationing right now. So there is this way of trying to control or constrain the people behind this idea. And this notion that we're all on board, that whatever is being said goes, whether or not that's actually true.
Yeah, I also want to say that the sign Sagittarius is associated with philosophy and religion and the notion of beliefs or what is right, what is wrong, moralism, ethics, etc. The moon in this chart is in the 8th house. The moon in this chart is in the 8th house. And the 8th is the place of death. Many astrologers would see it as a place of death. It's also the place of other people's resources. And I'm going to stop sharing in just a second because I forgot to put in some asteroids that I wanted to include in this chart. So let me take a moment of diversion for a second and just say that there's like 72,000 named asteroids and 200,000 that haven't been named yet. And astrology is a language of symbolism, and it's something that we can play with. But Demetra George has really led the way on using asteroids in astrological interpretation, and she has a technique of looking for asteroids with names that correspond with current events or people in current events and placing them in the chart. So in just a second, I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll pull up the asteroids for Israel. There's an asteroid named Israel. There's an asteroid named Ukraine. And there are no asteroids named Palestine or Philistine, but there is an asteroid named Arabia, which I think in some ways we can use as a stand-in for the Arab world in relationship to the United States and to the allies of the United States. But to go back to what Rose was saying, the moon sextiling Sun, Mercury, and then you'll see in a moment that the asteroid Israel is also at 26 degrees. So there's a partile conjunction between the Cazimi of Mercury and the Sun and Israel, Biden declaring solidarity with Israel. and sextiling the moon. And the moon is squaring Neptune in the 11th house. So there's really a mission statement that's coming through in this chart. And on the surface, on the speech side, you know, the mission statement is about solidarity with international partners for an 11th house dream or picture painting. Neptune in Pisces is very much an illustration of fantasy in a lot of ways, of a kind of, you know, united democratic world, and that this is the prerogative of the United States, is to spread its version of democracy across the world. But also underneath the U.S. solidarity with Israel, there's a real concerted interest in land. And in the position of Israel as a kind of proxy location for the United States to have access to fighting its wars in the Middle East, and also accessing oil, which of course the United States consumes the most fossil fuels out of any nation on earth. And the United States and Israel both have deeply vested interests in in the military industrial complex, as do all warring nations, by the way, including Russia, including China, Ukraine, etc. Weapons manufacturing is not a nationality, it's a trans-global industry that many people profit on, and many people profit in a kind of communal profiting, regardless of whether or not they are you know, adversaries or allies on a political spectrum. The weapons manufacturers don't see lines of nationality necessarily. They see money. Rose, will you share the Sibly chart for a second and talk about that while I add these asteroids?
I sure will.
Yeah, somebody's mentioning the South Node in Libra. We'll definitely be talking about the nodal axis in just a second. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that is, feels true. The weakening of just outcomes feels true. So for those who haven't seen the United States Sibly chart before, it's got a Sagittarius rising. So there's an idea of ideals, right? That we are expanding the notion of what it means to be a people. We've got a cluster of Sun, Jupiter, and Venus in Cancer, which kind of what it does is it shows us a way that Cancer, we think of it as being tied to home and nurturing, right? And kind of who is a part of your little cluster, who's invited into your shell. When we see it on a larger stage, we can see how the sign of Cancer can be tied to nationalism, to xenophobia, right? Because now it's not just who's included, it's who's excluded. We can see a little touch of zealotry because Jupiter is in there, as well as a kind of confidence and enthusiasm around your mission statement, whatever it should be. And with Venus, that we really value this idea that we belong and that what we do is justified. As a nation, we have Pluto down here in the second house at 27 degrees of Capricorn, where it is again now, right? This Pluto return. And the second house is our house of resources. And so there is this notion that the wealth of this nation comes from plundering, comes from extraction, comes from genocide, comes from dispossession, comes from all of these things that Renee and I have already kind of strung together and tied together around Pluto and Capricorn and what it means. Here is that moon. This has it at 26 degrees in 58 minutes, about 27 degrees of Aquarius. We've also got Uranus and Mars in Gemini. They happen to land on the descendant. So there is this idea that the seventh house is how we meet the world and meet other. So that we were born of war, we meet others as adversity or as competition as a country, and that we can be a little erratic in that expression as well because of this Uranus and Gemini, that we can be two-faced, we can play both sides and turn on a dime. And so this is all kind of baked into the idea of this nation. I also want to point out that the United States has Neptune in Virgo, which means that for the last 4 or 5 years, we've been going through and are finishing out a Neptune opposition as well, where we are confronted with the distance between our professed ideals and how things are actually playing out, right? The vision or the dream that allegedly this nation was founded under, which we all know was a profound lie, if we're being honest, or is very limited. And that is coming out, and there's this reflection and projection around what this country actually stands for and on. Do you have those asteroids up?
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. So here we are back at the Biden speech chart. So you can see that the asteroid Israel is at 26 degrees of Libra. So is the sun, and so is Mercury. So we've been talking about the superior conjunction of the sun and Mercury, this identification with the idea. And Israel is here. It's partal conjunct. It's absolutely wedded into the symbolism of the speech. And just after the Libra stellium, in the sign Scorpio, still in the 6th house, we have a fairly close conjunction of Mars and the asteroid Ukraine. And then the asteroid Ceres coming up just after that. And so in traditional astrology, the 6th house is the house of the military. And Scorpio is a Mars-ruled sign that is very closely associated with bloodshed and war, as well as with power, and particularly, again, powers of death and powers of militarization, psychological power. I mentioned at the beginning of, when I was thinking about my own intention for this conversation tonight. So I'm a person of Jewish descent, and my ancestors fled persecution. I have extended family who was killed in the Holocaust, who were killed in the labor camps in pogroms in Eastern Europe. And my grandparents and my father all faced persecution and violence in their lives in the United States. And I did not grow up very close to the Jewish faith. I want to say that my dad was he distanced himself from his religious practices or cultural practices, but he was a political, or is a political scientist, and definitely raised me to think critically about Zionism and to think critically about the plight of the Jewish people. And what has been coming up for me over the last 2 weeks has been so much heartbreak, and really feeling quite sick to my stomach at the current levels of violence. Really feeling the tragedy that Palestinians and Israelis and people all over the world who are really in the line of fire of colonial and imperial violence are facing. But I've been quite shaken, or shook, as they say, by the ways that I've been experiencing people interacting with me on social media. And as a content creator, I hold a somewhat large-ish platform. For a single human being to be talking to thousands of people is strange. I just want to say that it's really strange. And any of us who hold that position, and I would include, all leaders of all nations, as well as, like minor characters such as me who have fairly, small followings. But anybody who has a public platform, I would say, becomes an avatar of some kind. and an embodiment of something. And it has been shocking to me in the last couple of weeks that I have received messages from people accusing me of being both anti-Semitic and not activist enough in my support for Palestinian liberation. So I've been receiving criticism from people who tell me I'm too much on one side or too much on another, or not enough here or not enough there. And not receiving inside of that criticism any kind of recognition of me as a human being, maybe going through something that feels confusing and hard to grapple with, and that's bringing up a lot of my own trauma. And so as the daughter of my father, I am somebody who has been really affected by the trauma of forced migration and fleeing due to persecution and religious and cultural identity. And I'm also the daughter of a person who has a pretty extreme mental illness. And there is no way that I can separate my father's mental illness from his family trauma and what happened to him, to his father, to his grandparents, etc. And what I feel in my own relationship, and I am really not trying to speak for anybody else other than myself right now, in my own relationship to what happened to my family in their relationship to being Jewish and being persecuted, I feel an intense internalization of mistrust and terror in my own body that has been misplaced because I was not fleeing in my life. I was born an American. I embody white femininity. I've received a lot of privilege and a lot of comparable safety. But inside of my embodied experience, I also have the momentum of a people that I carry in my cellular memory. And this momentum has teeth to it. It has a kind of viciousness. And when its safety is threatened, it attacks. And I experienced this with my father and with the resonance of my grandparents and great-grandparents. And I've experienced this over the last couple of weeks, particularly with Jewish people and people supporting Israel, writing to me saying that I'm anti-Semitic and being really quick to want to attack me for showing solidarity and support to Palestinian people. And my support and solidarity for Palestinians is not, I want to say, religious. I feel that all people should be able to practice whatever religion they want. I personally don't practice religion. I don't agree with fundamentalist or dogmatic frameworks. And I like astrology because it's very complex. And that's about as close as I get to religion. But I do feel really sensitive to the fact that Israel has occupied Palestine for almost a century at this point, and that occupation has been enforced by the United States and by colonial powers, by Britain, has been militarized, and that Jewish people have been used as an excuse to form a military state. And I think that Palestinian people are being used by fascist, fundamentalist, terrorist groups. I would say that bodies are being put in the line of fire by Hamas. And I want to say clearly that I'm not supporting Hamas. But I do understand that terror begets terror. And the meaning of terror, the word terror, implies that the terror, the feeling of terror, the feeling of being terrorized creates terror. The meaning of the word terror is that the feeling of terror creates terror. And in terms of a cultural body and a communal body, and again, I'm only speaking for myself, the way that I feel the kind of collective body in the Jewish narrative is very deep. You know, it's thousands of years at this point of a story that definitely migrates through various landscapes in what is now known as the Middle East, but has been involved in multiple wars and displacements, and has been, a body that has been imprisoned and enslaved and has lost power and land and autonomy. And it has also been a body that has enforced enslavement and has imprisoned and has sought control and dominion over people. And the histories that are currently being activated in the present inflammation of a conflict that's been going on for a really long time, that, and this is another thing about, I'm kind of shocked at how social media activists, will get really kind of riled up around events, but often are not seeing that it's not episodic, that there are really long arcs to these stories. And when people write to me and they say, and I'm sharing information about Palestinian liberation or what's been happening in the Israeli occupation of Palestine, when they write to me and ask, does this mean that you support women being raped and babies being murdered? I'm wondering where that sentiment is for Palestinians over the last 75 years. And I'm wondering where that sentiment is for Indigenous people all over the world. And I'm wondering where that sentiment is for Black and Brown people in the United States who are disproportionately faced with state violence. And I'm wondering where that sentiment is for trans people and queer people everywhere. And the inflammation of trauma that war in a big communal way activates in our bodies, I think instigates us into a trance, or very easily invites us into a trance where in the trauma that is generations deep, we are activated almost instantaneously to take sides and to look for who we are fighting against. And the othering and the agitation and the inflammation of othering has been so present, I want to say, here, in the United States, in my bubble, in my collective world, in a way that is heartbreaking to me. And I wonder what does it do for us to project outwards in these very myopic, focused ways on particular conflicts, when a lot of times we don't really even know the breadth and the history of these conflicts, and to pit ourselves against each other? Like, what does that do for us? My feeling is that what's happening right now is yet another flare up in collective psyche that is hungry for war, and that is resounding with thousands of years of violence that have not been metabolized inside of the collective psyche. There are thousands of years of violence between the Abrahamic traditions, and particularly patriarchal and fascist currents in the Abrahamic traditions. That includes Christians and Jews and Muslims. These are faiths that can be so beautiful and grounded and rooted and deep and connected to really inclusive, very uplifting sense making. And these are also traditions that have been weaponized repeatedly. And I want to say primarily by men who want to fight each other, and by groups of people who want wealth and are fighting over land. And so when yet another inflammatory chapter begins, which is what's happening right now, it's an episode of a longer series of episodes, right? Like, we're looking at thousands of years of programming here. It's not just in the last 2 weeks that this current quote unquote conflict has been emerging, But when something happens like this that takes the collective psyche by hold and everybody's turned towards it, watch what happens in the interstitial spaces of relationship everywhere, because violence is escalating everywhere. And it's escalating against people of all backgrounds and ethnicities, but particularly against people who might be perceived as somehow identified within some side or another of this particular conflict. Anti-Semitism and violence against not just Palestinians, but Muslim Americans or people of Middle Eastern descent. And it's also escalating all over. It's escalating between people fighting about who knows what and who's right and what should happen or what shouldn't happen. And most of us don't even have a fucking clue, because it's old. It's really old. And I think what a lot of people are feeling is that they want peace, and that's the biggest clue, is we want peace. We want there to be an end to fighting. We want there to be an end to war. We want people to have food, shelter, safety, a place to raise their families, for children to become adults. We want stability in our world. We want to be able to think that we have a future of some kind. And when that gets threatened, our biological organisms respond in very quick, very basic, often not very thoughtful ways. And this is a moment that I think we can also look to Pluto and Capricorn, maybe from another dimension, and say that this is a moment that, yes, there is this kind of extreme polarization, and we can certainly see that with the nodal axis, North Node recently moving into Aries, South Node moving into Libra, a polarization of people and individuals with each other. There's a lot of strife. Eris is here with the North Node. There's intergenerational suffering and pain. Chiron is here. But in the earth signs, one potential way that we might read these earth signs, I think, is as transformation that can happen in the collective right now, as more and more of us feel that these storylines are not so cut and dry. And I think that what I just spoke about, my concerns around, these deeper kind of archetypal traumas, are probably basic to everybody here. I mean, I think that I'm in company right now with people who think in symbolism and in terms of archetypal bodies. But we are also in a larger company. We're living in a time when collective consciousness has changed pretty profoundly over the last couple of decades because of the internet and our capacities to speak to one another in broader ways, to share information like we are now. We're living at a time when Pluto's returning to the United States birthplace. And I would say that what's happening in the United States in terms of this moment of reckoning, and Pluto's transit through Capricorn has been major in the charts of a lot of the uprisings and reckonings that the US has had to go through around racial reckoning, in terms of murder of George Floyd, and many of the kind of uprisings from 2012 onwards. And because of that, we're in a unique moment in history when I think many people want a deeper answer, and they want something that's going to be more of a systemic solution. And while I certainly think that governmental diplomacy is necessary right now, and I want to, want myself and others to mobilize and pushing for relief for Gazans, and some kind of peace agreement as quickly as possible, I also feel that this is very much a time when the the coherence of our collective intelligence and capacity for transformation absolutely requires us to hold a big picture and to address the trauma that we each carry inside of our bodies. When we are fighting with each other, biting each other's face off, going at one another so quickly and with such vehemence, we are enacting othering. We are enacting violence upon one another. And this is a period of time that's extremely activating, and it's really easy to feel totally frustrated and unsafe. And a lot of people are literally unsafe, and there's so much that's frustrating. But terror will not produce anything other than terror. Violence is not going to produce peace. And as people, our governments are acting in our names. And we have some kind of power right now. And our power is in our voices and in our protests, but it's also in the work that we do in smaller ways to shift the militarization of the state. So for those of us like me who live on United States soil, how much of it, of every dollar that I make and spend, goes to the military? We are all complicit in this. When I engage with my own trauma body and rush to judge another person and argue with them and attack them, then I am complicit in a trauma body that rushes to judge and argues and attacks. And the United States is a trauma body that has rushed to judge and argue and attack in position of its own rightness. And I feel that we've all internalized that. You know, we've lived on a globe that has been profoundly shaped by supremacies: patriarchy, masculine supremacy, white supremacy, European supremacy, religious supremacy, and all of them are wanting to be right. And our consciousnesses and psyches and nervous systems are entrained around argument. We've learned to survive by knowing the answer and by getting something right. And that's not how we're going to find our way through this. We're going to find our way through this. I think this Saturn in Pisces could help us find our way through by letting go of the idea that we know and really trying to tune in with the feeling. Rose was talking about the sign Cancer. I don't know if you said anything about that yet, but really tuning in with the feeling of what's happening in our own psyches and communities right now.
I want to speak a little bit more to this division because it's really clear in this chart, and we haven't, I think, fully named the axes that it's working across. So we have stelliums in both the 6th house and the 12th house, and we have dug in a fair amount around the 6th house and its relationship to service, duty, the military, and this idea of coalescing consciously and aiming towards something and regimenting and disciplining ourselves towards something that we've chosen as our aim. And we have Mars there as well. And Mars in Scorpio can really be a placement that is hung up on vengeance. But on the other side of this, we've got Chiron and Eris, which both mythologically are very much about wounding and being excluded and not fitting. Now, the myths play out very differently, but they're in the sign of Aries. It's very much tied to individuation and identity. And so since 2018, Chiron has been in Aries, and I don't think that discrimination, wounding, pain around who we are fundamentally, or how we're trying to separate ourselves from the collective is new, but it's certainly been highlighted. And the house that these are found in, along with the North Node, along with Jupiter, along with Uranus, is the house of subconscious, of hidden enemies, of undoing, right? There's a lot of negative connotations with the 12th house, but part of that can't be separated from the context of capitalism and the value system that most of us have been steeped in. Because the 12th house is unstructured time. It's time in solitude. It is connecting to things larger than yourself. It is being tucked away outside of time. And so we have this, on the one side, very regimented, very conscious, very directed, this area that is being primed to go to war. And on the other side, we have undigested pain and trauma, but also the dream space. And so we have this tension around who gets to be hurt. Who is it? Is it the folks who have it together and can articulate and can kind of curry favor and have, you know, a Libran sense, have it together, can put on a good show, know what to say, know what not to say? Or is it this Aries side where we're just moving from pain and trying to defend? Aries is a sign that's ruled by Mars, which is reflective and reactive. It goes quick, it heats up fast, it cools down fast as well. But so we start to see this picture between Libra and Aries where we're kind of being divided along, where one side has justice and has a cool head and a clear conscience. It's got Pallas Athena, which is an asteroid and a mythic figure that is tied to strategy in war. And it's facing off with the wounded healer, right, with Chiron and Aries. And so there is this feeling of, if you don't have an articulate enough argument, if you are not civilized enough, you don't deserve a seat at the table. And how long has that violence been played out through imperialism, right? Designating a certain group of people as not being civilized enough to deserve dignity, safety, shelter, resources. And so we're seeing the way that we're being divided. And meanwhile, Pluto is in a square to both of these sides of these axes, right? So we have Pluto in Capricorn squaring the north and the south node, which have Mercury and the sun and Eris co-present there. And so there is a sense of being divided into camps and manipulated by the outside. And as Renee was talking about kind of the ancestral trauma that we all carry in our bodies, I think this Chiron and Aries and this Eris in the 12th house hold a lot of that charge. And the thing about Chiron is, initially in the myth, the wounding creates a sense of separation. I am not a god, I am not a person, I cannot die, I live in pain. And kind of the mending of that myth is realizing that our pain does not have to be a point of separation. It does not have to be a point where we become pitted against each other. It can actually be a point from which we can cultivate greater empathy and connection. That we can start to understand, if I hurt and you hurt, instead of us finding ways to keep hurting each other to figure out whose hurt is more righteous, we could realize that perhaps we could come together and try to lessen that in some way. And when we're looking at a T-square, which is what's being created with Pluto and with Eris and the North Node, and with the Sun and Mercury and the South Node, there's a way to look to the fourth point that would complete what's called a Grand Cross, which is 4 signs along an axis, right? And so in this case, it's the cardinal signs. It's Aries, Capricorn, Libra, and Cancer is what's missing. And Cancer is in the 3rd house here, the position that would complete this. And the 3rd house is about really pulling your scope in and realizing that, sure, I can have this kind of disembodied political identity where there's 2 teams and it's a fucking football game and this is my color and my side. Or I can look at who's around me. What does my life look like? What do I need? Who's hurting? What do I have? How can we connect and share? How can we advocate for the folks around us who are vulnerable and are in need, instead of just kind of thoughtlessly or mechanically giving to this war machine because we're fueled by these subconscious traumas, or because we're fueled by this kind of rallying cry for war, this manipulation by the state. Like they don't care if our kids eat at night. They don't care if we have a good education or healthcare. They care that Raytheon stock is going up. That's, you know.
When Rose was talking, I was looking at the dispositor of Jupiter and Uranus. So here in the 12th house is this, and Rose said, the place of the self-undoing, right? So in this particular chart, we might consider the self as the notion of the current era is put forward by colonial imperialism, by Biden as his avatar. And the place of self-undoing, the cusp is in Aries. And Rose was mentioning Eris and Chiron here. And one thing about Chiron is that Chiron's wound pattern roots, it begins with exclusion. It begins with abandonment. And so his story is always a story of not having a place. And the ways that not having a place or being other than what might be considered status quo or included within a kind of dominant framework, both provide somebody a healing path, a path that necessitates learning and resourcing oneself to deal with that pain, but also becomes a place of education for others. And in the ways that I think all of us on this call, maybe anybody right now living on planet Earth, might feel the pain of abandonment or exclusion, in the sense that we come from lineages that have been torn apart. We've been torn from land, we've been torn from one another, we've been torn from ourselves, we've been tried to we have been made into shapes that are unnatural for us. I think many of us live lives that contain so much what feels like unnecessary suffering in order to uphold the state. And Jupiter and Uranus are here. These are outer planets in Taurus, and there are profound changes happening on our planet right now that are going to be accelerated by any wars. So increasing militarization, increasing military presence, increasing the carbon offset of war does nobody a favor right now. And where the wars are happening will continue to disrupt global supply chains and will continue to feed into insecurity and instability for people everywhere, which will then in turn feed into increasing amounts of war between people and mistrust or hostility between people as resources become more scarce. Maybe that's one story. The dispositor of Taurus is Venus. So Venus rules Taurus, or I should say the dispositor of Jupiter and Uranus is Venus. Venus is in Virgo, actually at my natal degree, 9 degrees Virgo. This is a degree that is very devoted to service. But there's also I think I would say from inside a 9-degree Venus Virgo experience that there's a kind of insecurity around this particular service and a real desire to understand what and how is actually going to be of service. And so there can be a high degree of critique and criticism at this degree. And this is, I think, very much part of my intention tonight, to have a place where we can be critical of government in general. But Venus is also a a symbol in many ways of satisfaction and pleasure and bodily knowing of what is needed, right? And what is needed is pretty basic in Virgo. Food, shelter, security, some amount of safety or safer space. Venus is closely conjunct to the asteroid Arabia. Again, so I use this as a stand-in really for the Arab world. And Juno and Lilith are also conjunct at the first degree of Virgo. And it's really interesting to note that, you know, although Palestine has been occupied for 75 years, and there have certainly been periods of time when civil rights activists have managed to get more attention to Palestinian struggle. This, I think, is really the first time in history that so many in the Western world have paid attention. And in the United States, there's kind of like a 50-50 split happening right now, which is a departure from where the kind of public sentiment within the United States has been. And I think that this is due in part to what the United States has been going through over the last 15 years with Pluto and Capricorn, an increasing recognition that Palestinian struggle is not separate from struggle of marginalized, oppressed people everywhere, and from people everywhere who have experienced either in their lineages or currently experiencing the violence of occupied territory and land theft. And so I am curious about the potentials right now of what can happen in smaller, more private spaces. Rose was mentioning the third house and this missing link. The third house, like Rose said, is a coming in to who's close around you, into our neighborhood spaces and communal spaces. I'm curious what can happen when we make space inside of our families, communal spaces, classrooms, workplaces, where we gather and congregate in our places of worship. Can we make space to hold the complexity of struggle as all people might be affected by that complexity? And that means historic struggle, but also current struggle when it comes to the accelerating insecurity that everybody is facing financially, economically, and in terms of resource. You know, the apartheid state that we can see in Palestine or in Gaza right now, in some ways isn't that different than the apartheid state that's been happening in the United States for the last several hundred years. There is oppression that's happening everywhere. And if this is a moment that spurs consciousness into a bigger picture, then this is potentially a moment that can have a longer term impact beyond the territories currently known as Israel and Palestine, right? That this is a moment that can bring consciousness into shared struggle, ideally. Maybe the best possible outcome of this moment is there would be a heightened consciousness of shared struggle.
Well, and I think that's another, to loop it back to Renee, what you were saying about Saturn in Pisces, giving us a possibility to coalesce in some way, or to kind of see through the imagined separation, right? To realize the reality that our struggles are connected. There's also this galvanizing experience with Saturn being in opposition to both Juno and Lilith, which are archetypally, you know, Lilith would not submit, would not give up, and also turned away from that particular branch of the Abrahamic faith, right? Like, was like, you know what? I don't buy it. I'm out. And similarly, Juno, you know, in Greek mythology, which we have to read through the lens of patriarchy, Juno was the scorned wife of Zeus, right, was Hera, who her anger propelled her to fight back, to seek vengeance, but she also took up the cause of any other scorned woman, any child put in danger, infants, children, folks who are facing state violence. So there is something around how much work Venus is doing in this chart, because it not only disposits Jupiter and Uranus, it has a mutual reception with Mercury and Libra, but it also disposits the Sun, Mercury, and Pallas Athena in Libra. And with it conjoining the Star of Arabia, with it conjoining Lilith, and with it also conjoining Juno, there is this idea of kind of banding together around shared values that are actually much smaller and simpler. Just wanting to care for people and keep them alive, just wanting to feed people, just wanting children to not be murdered, right? Just wanting to not see this violence perpetuated and wanting to actually attain some sense of security, right? It's at the bottom of the chart in the fourth house, which is, for better and worse, what we associate with home. And all of this struggle is around what people can call a home. And the people who are suffering the most against this state-sanctioned violence are women, are children, are civilians, are folks who are just trying to live, to carve out a small corner for themselves. And so what does that mean? And is there a way that some of this Jupiterian energy, because Jupiter is forming a trine to Venus, can give us a path towards hope around smaller shared values that include valuing the earth and resources, that include rooting into our own bodies that are in fact the earth, that are not separate from it. And so I do wonder, though we feel this tension, I wonder if that tension can be galvanizing and connective rather than divisive and destructive.
So I think that we'll probably wrap it up soon and see what folks are thinking and feeling. But I did want to take a look actually at the eclipse chart. Do you happen to have that one up, Rose? Because I
The
can pull it
lunar
up.
eclipse?
Yeah, coming up on the 28th.
I don't have it pulled up
Okay.
right now.
I'll get that real quick. Yeah, let's look at that one. And I think I'm going to pull the chart also for Washington. You see.
It's a good idea.
Okay. Okay, so here we have the chart for the upcoming full moon lunar eclipse on October 28th. So we'll have entered Scorpio season. And the full moon eclipse is at 5 degrees of Taurus, so opposite the 5-degree Scorpio sun. This is the last eclipse in a series of eclipses that started in November of 2021. And that actually is an important eclipse series, and me and Rose having Zoom conversations about astrology. So happy kind of astro anniversary to us. 5 degrees Taurus is a point in the Sabian symbols where the unavoidably fertile, chaotic nature of Earth becomes dominant. And everything that has come into form will lose its form. And so the wisdom of that is that everything is temporary, that change is God, as our goddess Octavia reminded us. And that in taking part with change, we actually access bliss. And so the sublime feeling of non-attachment is communion with earthly intelligence in and of itself. When death happens and decay happens, there is ecstatic potential, actually, as our individual struggles and suffering dissolve, and our bodies are consumed by the great is. This particular eclipse is also happening the same day that Mars and Mercury both oppose Jupiter. And then Mars and Mercury will be conjunct the next day on the 29th. And Mars is also going to be resetting its synodic cycle. So it's kind of 2.5 year cycle with the sun. Later in Scorpio season, around mid-November, November 17th, is the Mars Sun Cazimi. And that's the beginning of a about 2.5, 3 year period of time in which Mars as an energetic really takes on a kind of Scorpio quality. So the last Mars Sun Cazimi was in Libra. It's been a long time since it happened in Scorpio. And that Cazimi will happen at 25 degrees of Scorpio, and it will be partile exactly trine with Neptune in Pisces. And Neptune in the late degrees of Pisces is resonating in some ways with early Taurus in the symbolism that really at the last degrees of Pisces were the very end of the zodiac. And so this is the place where all dissolving is happening. And everything is everything. There is no separation. Your body is made from stardust, and to dust your body will return. The paradigm that we're living in the current empire is one paradigm. And so many paradigms have existed in human consciousness, and this will not be the last one, and it certainly isn't the first one. And we have the opportunity to live through some kind of form of apocalypse, as many groups of humans have done before, and new worlds will be born. So in this eclipse chart and in the subsequent couple of weeks of movement, as Sun, Mars, and Mercury all move towards conjunction in the late degrees of Scorpio, Ceres will be definitely a big part of that. And actually the Mars Sun Cazimi, November 17th, is also partile conjunct with Ceres. And someone shared in the chat a while back that isn't Ukraine known as the bread bowl of Eastern Europe? And Ceres as a symbol is very much associated with grain and with nourishment and agriculture. And also similar to Lilith and Juno, Ceres is a feminine deity who practiced politics of resistance. And she went up against Zeus and Pluto, or Hades, I should say. So the kind of god of the gods, the god on the top of the mountain, and then the god of the underworld. She went up against them and basically said, I'm going to stop growing grain, and you're going to stop getting your sacrifices, motherfuckers, if you don't negotiate with me. And so her myth has a lot to do with negotiation and politics of resistance. I do want to say that for those of us living in imperial nations, and particularly in the Western world, and if you live in colonizer countries, Great Britain, the United States, Australia, has just gone through a kind of another round of refusal to honor, recognize Indigenous people. We do have access to politics of resistance. We can boycott, we can make some kind of commotion with the ways that we organize around labor and money, particularly, and food. And politics of resistance doesn't have to just be refusal or denial. It can also be refusal to participate in certain things because we're participating in other things. And so Ceres participated in extending care. That's part of her myth, was to practice care and practice nurturing, and to practice care and nurturing of those who were not her own. So care and nurturing of other people's children. And the full moon eclipse, again, is the last in a series that started in November of 2021. And over this period of time, the North Node has been moving through Taurus. This has been a time of accelerating consciousness of embodiment. I want to uplift that there are a lot of people who are recognizing the benefits of practicing mind-body technologies that are super helpful in disarmament, right? In doing the work of co-regulating and disarming and down-regulating states of violence and reactivity. I want to say that North Node in Taurus is also a period of time in which a lot of people have been activated by climate crisis and are really questioning deeply held values and relationship to value, and asking themselves what actually is valuable and what do we need to invest in. And that as we move towards the Sun-Mars Ceres triple conjunction in November that will trine Neptune, my hope is that all of us can remember that we are tiny and time is enormous. And that, you know, I was talking a while ago about like ancestral currents that I feel moving through me. And I want to give such a bow and gratitude to freedom fighters and people who I know personally now, who are living lives that have been deeply shaped by generations of struggle, who remind me again and again that the struggle that we are in right now did not just begin, and it won't end tomorrow. And that we can participate now for our children's children's children. We can participate now for the children's children's children of those who are surviving in Israel and Palestine and all over the world. We are entering into a remarkably different landscape over the course of the next couple of years. Pluto will be leaving Capricorn and moving into Aquarius at the same time as Neptune leaves Pisces and moves into Aries, and Uranus leaves Taurus and moves into Gemini, and Saturn and Neptune will both be moving into Aries at the same time. And in 2025, all the outer planets are changing signs, and they're all aspecting one another. We're going to have sextiles between Pluto in Aquarius, Neptune and Saturn in Aries, and Uranus in Gemini for almost a year. And there are lots of reads on that astrology that could talk about more war. And we probably will have it, just given the way that things are going. I really want a presence that whatever we can share right now in terms of healing practices and healing mind states and places where people can do the work of unwinding the trauma that lives in their body, it will eventually seep into collective consciousness. And those tools are going to be necessary as empire falls and kills itself and a lot of us with it. And this is a period of time in which I think the notion of sacrifice, Neptune and Pisces is a big key word, and Scorpio as a big key word. Sacrifice is to make sacred, and that where we find opportunities now to sacrifice possessiveness and ownership and righteousness in order to connect with one another and really find deeper solutions of embodied healing that can transgress the militarized borders of consciousness that the last 3,000 years have, fomented into our nervous systems. That there's hope there for me. I want to say that, and I want to invite us all to kind of feel into a big time scale of 7 generations.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. I'm just thinking of this Bobby Sands quote that's been going around recently that is, our revenge will be the laughter of our children. And holding that as a vision to move away from vengeance and to understand that to most folks who inflict harm are traumatized, right? That it's a thing that is passed from generation to generation, from group of people to group of people, and that we need to kind of disavow this notion that if I've been hurt, I couldn't possibly hurt another person, because we know that's patently false, but to also become disenchanted with the idea that because I've been hurt, someone else must now suffer, that my suffering justifies paying that forward in some way. And how do we find justice? That I don't think that justice and vengeance are actually compatible. And so how do we find justice in a world that insists that we must find it through vengeance or through punishment or through kind of the elimination of any threat to our security?
So Rose and I have just talked for a long time. Hopefully we said something that was halfway coherent and maybe interesting. I think that this would be a good place for us to pause and to invite people to respond. And we are recording, and we are going to be sharing this recording on YouTube. And so when you respond, if you do not wish to be recorded, just let us know and I'll pause the recording. And you can also share in the chat and one of us can read it out loud. And you can also keep your video off if you want to unmute and speak into the space. So I'm curious if anyone feels compelled to share, if anything has kind of come up for you in your own astrological research and associations, or in your own symbolic associations, or in your body or in your heart. And in the sharing, again, I want to invite people to practice compassion for human beings. And I think as much as possible, I really want to invite us all also to try and speak for ourselves. And so if you, like me, feel identified with a collective identity, like I might feel with Jewish people, I don't know if I did a great job of it, but I really tried to speak for myself and not speak for all Jewish people. And so if you are having an experience that you want to share and there's some kind of identification with a collective body, to really invite people to speak from their own experience and to not speak for others. Yeah, so with that, if anybody has something that they'd like to share, you can use the raise hand in the reaction button and we can unmute you. And thanks for joining us, those of you that need to go. Oh, I see a comment. Kat is saying, thinking about that palace opposition to Chiron as rationality over rage, how at times this is suppression, at other times this is mercy. Yeah, and so Pallas, some people might know, Pallas Athena in myth was the goddess that was born from her father's head, and she came out fully clothed in battle armor. And she is both a warrior and a medic. And Pallas is really associated with the ability to see patterns in long-term and big picture and strategy.
Wasn't she actually Metis's child, and then Zeus ate them both? Or is it?
Oh, I don't know.
Have to.
Yeah, Kat says, yeah. Kat, do you want to share about Pallas? I think you have a connection to her. Also, no worries if you don't, but if you do, we can unmute you.
Hi. Um, yeah, I do have some connection to Pallas. Um, I think she's one of the most complex asteroid goddesses, one of the four first found. And Rose is right. Pallas was the daughter of Metis. Yeah, I forget how that's spelled, but she was a sea god and um represented a lot of feminine principles, and the idea of Pallas and her mother being swallowed and only Pallas making it out was this digestion of the matriarch and like feminine principles in service of a masculine patriarchal society. But Pallas to me is this complicated figure where she's trying to survive in this point in the world where there's already been a lot of colonization, especially of her maternal line. And she is in this place of, I am the daughter of a colonizer and the daughter of an ocean goddess. And I have to hold these both. And the world looks like it's going this way towards patriarchy. How can I bring compassion, and how can I like heal these wounds in a certain way? But she does, there are stories where she does like sacrifice feminine and matriarchal values to sort of survive herself and to sort of seem right, like in that right. And she does hold those sort of Libra qualities of wanting justice to be black and white sometimes. And I think the interesting thing is that she has something in common with Libra, which is that she's often in opposition with Mars or Aries, right? So this is a really interesting place for Pallas to be in that chart and right now.
Pat, thank you for bringing that in. Anecdotally, I want to say that I have a number of clients who are high profile, high power femmes who work in male dominated spaces. And I think in a lot of ways to be high profile, high power is to be in a male dominated space in our current world. And these are often, and I've seen this also with cis men who bring in more feminine values and principles into the work that they do. And what Kat was mentioning, I see play out a lot in my clients' charts where there's a need to interface with the system and also a simultaneous subversion of the system, or knowing where maybe they might be working towards other means. I have Pallas in the 6th house in Capricorn, and since Pluto entered Capricorn in 2008, I've been on a journey of being an entrepreneur and a business person. And that journey has involved a lot of unpacking for myself what business means and how I want to be engaging with my own need to employ people and to like deal with ownership and branding and things like that. And when Pluto was passing my natal Pallas is when I had a pretty big kind of declaration moment for myself about wanting to use the platform of my business in anti-capitalist ways, and really shifting in how I was doing business to engage with it differently. And still staying in business, still kind of thinking about using the structure of having a business to achieve some other kinds of means. So thanks for that, Kat, and for re-mentioning Pallas. I know you mentioned her earlier in the chat, and I kind of saw it and then forgot about it. So thank you for bringing her back. Anyone else have anything come up that you'd like to share with our group? And questions are also welcome. Your observations are really welcome. There's, you know, so much that everybody can add. Astrology is enormous. Rose and I rambled a long time, and we probably only said like a little bit of what we've been thinking.
The tip of the voice notes, you know.
The tip of the voice notes. Give it maybe one more minute for people to share. Oh, Kat mentioned again, yes, that archetype of boss bitch, but inverted to serve the community rather than the capitalist. Palace is called the city protectress. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. I guess that's making me think of, you know, with Palace's position in the chart, and maybe I'll just share the chart again. In Palace's position of the, where's that Biden speech chart? That's George Bush's. So Palace is in Libra, also in the 6th house of military. Pretty close to opposition with Chiron. You know, this really, it does make me think about how we can push inside of legislation from the people, you know, and I think the work that is happening right now around solidarity with labor, you know, feels important in this moment, and solidarity around resource. That the 6th house is also the place or a place where people are of service to something that's bigger than them. And so I guess something is coming up for me with what Kat has been sharing about the ways that we are complicit in terms of consumption and industry and like status quo norms, and how for those of us who have the privilege of living in a place right now that isn't under siege in the way that Gaza is under siege, like if we have safety in our homes and we are still going to work every day, but we're also living in a world that is becoming increasingly unstable. And I think probably a lot of us on this call, I definitely feel this, you know, every day I go to work, I'm like, but why am I doing this? You know, it's like, what am I working towards? And I feel very incredibly fortunate to be able to have a job as an astrologer, but I also have to consistently remind myself that my purpose in working this job, and this goes back to what I was sharing about my 6th house journey, is actually not to make money. It's not to become a celebrity. It's not to like boost my own ego. It's to share healing tools and to be in community with people who will subvert the status quo dominant culture. And that's what I'm doing with astrology. And so I wonder about the power of all of us in our own small lives, you know, in the ways that we go to work, in the ways that we conduct our relationships with one another, and who we choose to bank with and what we choose to invest in, you know, that there are choices that we can be making to subvert this dominant culture that we also have to survive inside of, you know, that we are complicit in it necessarily by needing to survive and participate in the mechanisms of survival, but that there are ways that we can be strategic in our participation that are also working for change.
And that just brings me to one other point that I've been thinking about with this 12th house is there's actually a lot of disruptive energy. We have Uranus, the planet of revolution, disruption, shock, and surprise. We have Eris, the goddess of discord. And then I also think that Aries as an energy can be really disruptive. And when I'm looking at the north-south node axis with Aries and Libra, some of it is really anarchy versus bureaucracy. And I think that a lot of folks think of anarchy as just pure chaos, when in fact it's stepping into the gaps that institutions leave. It's not waiting for the government to do the right thing. It's knowing they probably won't and figuring out how to use the tools that we have. And the other point that I was just thinking of is that the 12th house, where we find Chiron, Eris, the North Node, Jupiter, and Uranus, is a gestational space. This is where seeds are being planted. This is where things are germinating. So what are the ways that we can disrupt with the Jupiterian tinge? What are the ways that we can kind of connect through our shared pain or our disparate pain and find ways to kind of ruin the party towards peace?
Yeah, disrupt through disarming. I mean, to refuse to tear each other down as we're also adamant inside of our politics, I think is enormous work. To be adamant for politics of peace and to not be people pleasing, avoidant, I don't want to get involved, but to really involve ourselves when we see that there's violence happening, but to do it in a way that really seeks to honor everybody's humanity and the trauma that they're coming from is enormously challenging, I think, and it really requires a lot of inner work. It requires the capacity to self-reflect and to be embodied and attuned in relationship. Please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to speak out in the group, and we'll probably go for another 15 minutes and then we'll call it a night. Or we'll go for another 15 minutes if people have enough to say. Okay, I'll give it another 30 seconds. Thanks for joining us from the later time zones. Okay, last call. Anybody want to say something? Last call. Last call to speak into the space. All right, Rose, do you have any closing that you want to offer?
I think I already said it.
Yeah. Well, in the spirit of non-completion, there's nothing complete about this conversation. I want to say that I feel like I've gone down a number of foxholes and coyote trails in all of this. And I have a lot of questions, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be in conversation with Rose. I'm really grateful for your friendship and colleagueship. I'm super grateful for the language of astrology, and to everybody who wants to participate in these kinds of discussions and spaces. Thank you for being here. We're going to post this video on YouTube. If you want to watch it again or share it or think about it or respond in comments, it'll also be on the circle space for Embodied Astrology. Rose is going to say something.
I was just going to say thank you for texting me on Friday and asking if I wanted to do this, and for facilitating so generously. And thank you all for joining us. and holding the space with integrity and compassion. It's really nice to be here. Way better than the rest of the internet.
Yes. All right. Thank you, everyone. Hope you are safe. Hope you feel safe. Hope you are healthy and happy, and that you feel healthy and happy, and that you can share and spread that with those around you. Bye for now.